The Grand Council chamber stretched 300 meters across, carved from a single piece of crystallized starlight that the Vexari had harvested from the core of a dying sun. Representatives from 47 different species sat in their designated sections, each seat designed to accommodate the wildly different physiologies that made up the galactic community. The air hummed with translation matrices, converting thousands of languages into comprehensible thought patterns that everyone could understand. Marcus Webb sat alone in the human delegation area, feeling distinctly out of place. His brown leather jacket looked shabby compared to the bioluminescent robes of the Caltharians or the quantum-shifting armor of the Drex warriors. He was the only human present, which made sense considering humanity had only joined the galactic community 6 months ago. Most of the elder species still weren't sure what to make of Earth and its inhabitants. The emergency session had been called to address territorial disputes in the Outer Arm, but Marcus knew the real reason he'd been summoned. Someone wanted to make an example of humanity. Someone wanted to show the newest members of the galactic stage exactly where they belonged in the pecking order. That someone was currently making his entrance. The chamber fell silent as Ambassador Curvan of the Gorth Dominion strode through the main doors. At 3 meters tall, covered in thick gray fur that rippled with barely contained muscle, Curvan looked like something Earth legends had whispered about for centuries. His kind had been exploring the galaxy for over 15,000 years, conquering and subjugating hundreds of worlds before the Galactic Council had finally forced them into a diplomatic framework. They were still one of the most feared species in known space. Behind Curvan walked his bodyguards, for more Gorth whose eyes constantly scanned for threats. The ambassador's claws clicked against the crystalline floor as he moved to his seat, directly across from Marcus. The positioning wasn't accidental. Nothing in galactic politics ever was. Marcus met his gaze steadily. He'd been briefed about Gorth intimidation tactics. The staring. The subtle displays of physical dominance. The way they evaluated other species like predators sizing up prey. He'd been warned not to show weakness, but also not to provoke them. Walk the diplomatic tightrope, his superiors had said. Don't give them any excuse to paint humanity as barbaric or uncivilized. The session began with opening statements from Council Arbiter Zelnoth, a floating jellyfish-like being whose tentacles glowed with different colors to express emotion. Currently, they were a worried purple. We gathered today to discuss the incidents in Sector 779. Zelnoth's voice echoed through translation. 3 colony worlds now claim ownership of the Delcary mineral fields. This council must determine the rightful claimant before these disagreements escalate into conflict. The representatives from each claimant species began their arguments. The Tertullians cited ancient star charts showing their ancestors had surveyed the system first. The Brennix Collective argued that their colony ship had been en route for 200 years, giving them priority. The Caltharians claimed they'd purchased the rights from a now-extinct species and had the documentation to prove it. Marcus listened carefully, taking notes on his tablet. Earth had no stake in this particular dispute, but studying how galactic law worked was crucial for humanity's future. Every session taught him something new about the complex web of treaties, precedents, and power dynamics that governed interstellar relations. Then, Curvan stood to speak, and the entire room tensed. The Gorth Dominion has reviewed these claims. His voice rumbled like an avalanche. We find them all lacking in merit. The Delcary system falls within our traditional sphere of influence. Our ancestors hunted in those systems when most of you were still learning to make fire. We claim it by right of strength. Murmurs rippled through the chamber. Claiming territory by right of strength wasn't technically legal anymore, not since the Dominion had been forced to sign the Accord of Peaceful Coexistence 3,000 years ago. But the Gorth had ways of getting what they wanted. They always did. Ambassador Curvan. Zelnoth's tentacles flashed orange with agitation. The Council has been very clear that territorial claims must be based on established legal frameworks, not military might. Of course, Arbiter, Curvan bared his teeth in what might have been a smile. I simply wanted to remind everyone of the historical context. However, if the Council insists on legal frameworks, the Dominion is prepared to present our documentation as well. We have records of Gorith outposts in the Delcari system dating back 7,000 years. Those outposts were military installations used during your expansion wars. One of the Keltharian representatives objected. They were specifically excluded from territorial considerations under the terms of your surrender. Curvan's fur bristled. The word surrender was clearly a sore point. We did not surrender. We agreed to a mutual cessation of hostilities. There is a difference, insect. The Keltharian's crystalline body flushed red with anger. But before they could respond, Zelnoth intervened. This council will not tolerate personal insults. Ambassador Curvan, you will address fellow representatives with respect or be removed from these proceedings. For a moment, Marcus thought the Gorith was going to challenge the Arbiter. His massive hands clenched and unclenched, claws extending and retracting. Then he gave a slight bow. My apologies, Arbiter. I allowed my passion for my people's interests to overcome my diplomatic training. The words were correct, but the tone suggested anything but remorse. The session continued for another hour, with each side presenting evidence and arguments. Marcus watched the dynamics carefully. The Tertullians had the weakest case and seemed to know it, spending most of their time trying to forge alliances with the other claimants against the Gorith. The Brennix Collective had strong documentation, but little military power to back their claims. The Keltharians had both law and a considerable defense force, which made them the most serious contenders. But Curvan dominated the room through sheer presence. When he spoke, others fell silent. When he moved, eyes tracked him. The Gorith had perfected the art of intimidation over millennia, and, even in a supposedly civilized diplomatic setting, that old predator instinct made everyone wary. As the session moved toward recess, Curvan rose and began walking toward the refreshment area. His path took him directly past the human delegation section. As he passed Marcus, he paused. "Ah, the human," he said, as if just noticing Marcus for the first time. "I've heard about your species. New to the stars, yes? Still learning how things work out here." Marcus stood to face him properly. Even standing, the top of his head barely reached Curvan's chest. "We're learning quickly, Ambassador. I'm sure you are." Curvan's eyes gleamed with amusement. "Your kind is aggressive for such a small species. We've reviewed your historical records. So much warfare among your own kind. Thousands of years of killing each other over resources, territory, ideology. Quite primitive." Other representatives were watching now, curious to see how the human would respond to such obvious baiting. "Every species goes through growing pains," Marcus replied evenly. "I'm sure the Gorith were perfect diplomats from the moment they developed spaceflight. A few species made sounds that might have been laughter." Curvan's expression darkened slightly. "The difference, human, is that we were strong enough to unite our world under one banner. We didn't waste centuries squabbling like children. When the weak challenged the strong, they were reminded of their place. Natural order was maintained." "Fascinating philosophy," Marcus said, "though I notice the Council doesn't allow you to operate under those principles anymore." The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Several representatives quietly moved farther away, not wanting to be close to what might happen next. Curvan leaned down, bringing his face close to Marcus's. His breath was hot and smelled like raw meat. "Careful, human. Your species is very new here, very vulnerable. It would be unfortunate if you made enemies before you understood how things truly work." Marcus felt his heart pounding, but he kept his voice steady. "Is that a threat, Ambassador?" "A friendly warning. From one who has seen many species arrive with grand hopes, only to find themselves overwhelmed by the realities of galactic politics. Some species thrive. Others," he made a dismissive gesture, "others are forgotten." "Thank you for your concern," Marcus said. "But humanity has survived worse than political maneuvering." "Have you?" Curvan straightened up, towering over Marcus. "You've survived conflicts with your own kind, in your own tiny corner of one galaxy arm. Out here, The stakes are somewhat different. Out here, there are beings who could obliterate your entire world and not lose a moment's sleep over it. Another threat? Marcus asked quietly. A statement of fact. Your Earth sits in a very desirable location. 3 major trade routes within 10 light years. Rich asteroid fields. A remarkably balanced ecosystem. Do you know how many species have made inquiries about purchasing rights to your system? Quite a few. The only reason your world remains sovereign is because the Council voted to grant you provisional membership. But provisional status can be revoked, human, especially if humanity proves too problematic. Marcus felt anger rising in his chest. He'd been dealing with bullies his whole life, from the playground to the military to corporate boardrooms. Curvan was just another bully, albeit one who stood 3 meters tall and represented a civilization that could probably turn Earth to ash if they wanted to. But bullies only respected strength. Marcus had learned that lesson early and learned it well. Ambassador Curvan, he said, his voice carrying clearly through the chamber. I appreciate you taking time from your busy schedule to educate me about galactic realities. However, I think there's something you should understand about humanity. Oh, Curvan's tone dripped with condescension. Please enlighten me. We don't respond well to intimidation. We never have. You can threaten us, try to scare us, wave your power in our faces, but all you'll do is make us more determined to stand our ground. It's not logic. It's not smart. It's just who we are. How quaint, Curvan rumbled. Bravery born of ignorance. I've seen it before. It usually ends poorly. Maybe, Marcus acknowledged. But here's the thing about humans. We're stubborn. Unreasonably so. We fought wars we couldn't win, climbed mountains that killed us, explored places that destroyed us, all because someone said we couldn't or shouldn't. We have a word for people who try to intimidate us into submission. We call them bullies. And we have a long, proud tradition of standing up to bullies, regardless of the consequences. Curvan's eyes narrowed. You're either very brave or very foolish, human. Probably both, Marcus admitted. But I'm also tired of listening to you make veiled threats while pretending to be friendly. So let me be clear. Humanity isn't interested in being anyone's client species. We're not looking for a patron to hide behind or a master to serve. We're here as equals, regardless of how new we are to the galactic stage. And if that offends you or any other species, well, that's unfortunate, but it's not going to change. The chamber had gone completely silent. Every representative was watching the confrontation between the massive Gorith and the small human. This kind of direct challenge was rarely seen in council chambers, where most species had learned to couch their disagreements in diplomatic language. Curvan stared at Marcus for a long moment. Then, slowly, he reached out with one massive hand and placed it on Marcus's shoulder. The weight was considerable, and the message was clear. The Gorith could crush him with almost no effort. Such spirit, Curvan said softly. Such defiance. It reminds me of another species we encountered long ago. The Velix Pact they called themselves. They stood up to the Dominion too. Refused to show proper respect. Insisted they were equals. He paused. There are no Velix anymore, human. They exist only in historical databases now. Their pride was their downfall. Marcus looked at the hand on his shoulder, then back up at Curvan's face. Every instinct told him to back down, to apologize, to play the diplomat. His superiors would want him to de-escalate. The smart move was to bend a little, show he could be reasonable. But Marcus thought about Earth, about humanity, standing on the edge of something enormous, about to step onto a stage where species millennia older would be watching, judging, deciding if humans were worthy of respect or just another primitive species to be managed and controlled. He thought about all the humans who'd stood up to tyrants throughout history, who'd said no when every rational calculation said they should say yes, who'd chosen dignity over safety, pride over survival. And he made his choice. Marcus slapped him. It wasn't a hard slap. It wasn't meant to hurt. It was the kind of slap you'd give someone who was being absurdly dramatic, the kind meant to snap someone out of hysterics or knock some sense into them. An open palm across the face, quick and sharp. The sound echoed through the Grand Council chamber like a gunshot. For 3 full seconds, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The entire council seemed frozen in a moment of absolute disbelief. Curvan's head had barely moved from the impact. Marcus's hand probably hurt more than the Gorth's face. But the insult, the sheer audacity of the gesture, hit far harder than any physical blow could have. The Gorth ambassador's eyes widened. His lips pulled back, revealing teeth designed for tearing flesh. A sound emerged from deep in his chest, something between a growl and a roar that made several nearby representatives scramble backward. Marcus stood his ground, heart hammering, knowing he'd just done something either incredibly brave or incredibly stupid. Possibly both. You? Curvan's voice was barely controlled. You dare. The 4 Gorth bodyguards were already moving, rushing toward Marcus with clear intent. But before they could reach him, Arbiter Zelnoth's voice cut through the chamber, amplified to painful volumes. Stop. All of you, stop this instant. The bodyguards froze mid-stride. Curvan's claws, which had started to extend, slowly retracted. The Arbiter's tentacles were flashing a brilliant red that Marcus's briefings had told him meant absolute authority being invoked. This is a council of peace, Zelnoth declared. Violence is forbidden within these walls. Ambassador Curvan, control yourself and your guards. Human Marcus Webb, remain where you are. Marcus noticed he'd unconsciously shifted into a defensive stance, weight-balanced, ready to move. Years of military training were hard to override. He forced himself to straighten up, though he kept his eyes on Curvan. The Gorth was trembling with rage, every muscle in his massive body tensed. But he gave a sharp gesture to his guards, and they reluctantly stepped back. When he spoke, his voice was deadly quiet. This human has assaulted a council ambassador. The penalty for such action is expulsion from the community and immediate sanction of their homeworld. You demand nothing, Zelnoth interrupted. I am reviewing the recording of this incident now. Every council session was recorded from multiple angles, stored in quantum matrices that couldn't be altered or falsified. It took only moments for the Arbiter to review what had happened. Ambassador Curvan, Zelnoth said slowly, you made direct physical contact with Representative Webb first. You placed your hand on his person. Under council law, he was within his rights to defend his personal space. I touched his shoulder. I did not strike him. The law does not distinguish between types of physical contact. You initiated. He responded. Both actions were inappropriate, but yours came first. If you wish to pursue formal charges, we will need to examine the full context of your conversation, including the statements you made about obliterating his world and the veiled threats regarding humanity's provisional status. Curvan's jaw clenched. Having the full conversation examined would reveal that he'd been deliberately trying to intimidate the human representative. It would show him violating the spirit, if not the letter, of council protocol. The Gorth Dominion's reputation was already problematic. This wouldn't help. I see, he finally said. Then perhaps we should consider this matter closed. A misunderstanding between representatives, nothing more. Perhaps, Zelnoth agreed, though the purple color returning to their tentacles suggested they weren't buying it. However, Representative Webb's actions have raised questions that this council must address. Marcus's stomach sank. This was it. This was where they'd find some technicality to punish Earth for his actions. He just handed them the excuse they needed. But what Zelnoth said next surprised everyone. Representative Webb, you claim that humanity does not respond well to intimidation and has a tradition of standing up to bullies. Is this accurate? Marcus blinked. Yes, Arbiter. That's an accurate assessment of human nature. And you chose to demonstrate this through physical retaliation rather than diplomatic protest. Marcus paused, trying to find words that wouldn't make things worse. In a moment, Arbiter, it seemed like the most honest response. Ambassador Curvan had made it clear he didn't respect diplomatic language. So I responded in a language I thought he would understand. Several species made interested noises at that. The Drex warrior representatives seemed particularly attentive. Violence as communication, Zelnoth mused. Crude, but unfortunately effective in certain contexts. Representative Webb, do you understand that your actions could have severe consequences for your species? Yes, Arbiter. And yet you chose to act anyway. Why? Marcus considered his words carefully. The truth was probably his best option at this point. Because I believe that being respected is more important than being liked. Humanity is new here. We're small, weak compared to most of you, and we don't have thousands of years of galactic history backing us up. If we let ourselves be pushed around now, it sets a precedent. It tells everyone that humans can be intimidated, threatened, dominated. I didn't want to send that message. So you sent a different message, Zelnoth observed. That humans are violent and unpredictable. That humans have boundaries. Marcus corrected. And we'll defend them, even when it's not the smart thing to do. Maybe that makes us violent. Maybe it makes us unpredictable. But it also makes it very clear where we stand. Curvan laughed suddenly, a booming sound that startled everyone. The human has more spine than I expected. Perhaps there is hope for your species after all, Marcus Webb. Marcus wasn't sure if that was meant as a compliment or another threat. With the Gorath, it was probably both. This council will recess for 1 hour, Zelnoth announced. During this time, I will consult with the Elder Circle about how to proceed regarding this incident. All representatives are to remain in the facility. As the Arbiter floated away, followed by their attendants, the chamber erupted into conversation. Representatives from dozens of species were talking, gesturing, clearly debating what they'd just witnessed. Marcus sank back into his seat, suddenly exhausted. His hand throbbed where it had connected with Curvan's face. The adrenaline that had carried him through the confrontation was fading, leaving behind the cold realization of what he'd done. He'd struck a council ambassador in front of 47 species. Humanity's entire future in the galactic community might have just been jeopardized because he couldn't control his temper for 5 more seconds. His communicator buzzed. A message from Earth, from Director Chun of the Diplomatic Corps. It had only been a few minutes since the incident, which meant someone was watching the council feeds in real time and had immediately escalated this to the highest levels. The message was brief. Stand by for conference call in 10 minutes. Don't say anything else to anyone until then. Marcus closed his eyes and took a deep breath. At least they weren't immediately disavowing him. That was something. That was either the bravest or stupidest thing I've seen in 300 years of council sessions. Marcus opened his eyes to find a being standing next to him. It was a Tyrolean, one of the species competing for the Delcary system. They looked vaguely reptilian, with scales that shifted colors to reflect their mood. Currently, they were showing an amused green. Probably stupid, Marcus admitted. Oh, definitely stupid, the Tyrolean agreed. The Gorath don't forget insults. They hold grudges for generations. You've made an enemy today that will last longer than your natural lifespan. That's comforting. But, the Tyrolean continued, you've also made an impression. Every species in this chamber is now reassessing humanity. Before today, you were just another primitive species that got lucky enough to develop faster than light travel. Now you're interesting. I'm not sure being interesting is a good thing in galactic politics. Better than being ignored, the Tyrolean said. Or worse, being pitted. Pity is how species end up as client states, protected and controlled by their betters. You've shown that humans won't accept that role quietly. Trust me, that matters more than you realize. Before Marcus could respond, several more representatives approached. A Caltharian crystalline being, a Brennix collective hive mind speaker, even one of the Drex warriors. Each wanted to express their opinion on what had happened, and Marcus was surprised to find that most were more curious than hostile. The Drex warrior, who introduced himself as Commander Thex, was particularly interested. Your species has military traditions? Thex asked, his voice like gravel being crushed. Extensive ones, Marcus confirmed. Thousands of years of warfare, unfortunately. Warfare is not unfortunate, Thex said. It is the crucible that forges strong civilizations. The Drex became mighty through conquest. We respect strength and the willingness to use it. Your action today, striking the Goroth, shows strength. Foolish strength, perhaps, but strength nonetheless. Thank you? I think. The Goroth are powerful, but they're also arrogant, Fex continued. They believe their size and history make them superior to all others. It is good to see someone remind them that power comes in many forms. Physical might is just one. The might to stand your ground against a greater foe is another. Marcus's communicator buzzed again. The conference call was ready. I need to take this, he told the gathered representatives. Of course, the Tyrolean said. We'll be watching to see what your superiors decide. Good luck, human. I think you're going to need it. Marcus moved to a private conference booth at the edge of the chamber. The booth sealed itself, ensuring privacy, and then his screen activated showing 5 faces. Director Chun of the Diplomatic Corps, General Martinez of Earth's Defense Force, Ambassador Liu who oversaw all off-world relations, Dr. Sarah Kim from the Xenopsychology Division, and surprisingly Secretary General Thompson himself. Having the leader of Earth's unified government on a call meant this was even more serious than Marcus had thought. Before anyone says anything, Marcus began, I want to apologize. I lost my temper and I jeopardized. Shut up, Webb. General Martinez interrupted, but he was smiling. Let's talk first. Director Chen leaned forward. Marcus, what you did was technically a violation of protocol. It was undiplomatic, reckless, and could have resulted in serious consequences. I should be furious with you. I sense a but coming, Marcus said carefully. But Ambassador Liu picked up, the reaction from other species has been fascinating. In the last 15 minutes, we've received communications from 11 different civilizations. The Drex hierarchy has requested formal military exchange discussions. The Tyrolean Commonwealth has offered trade negotiations. 3 other species have expressed interest in cultural exchanges. Even some of the neutral parties that haven't contacted us before are suddenly very interested in humanity. Marcus blinked. That's unexpected. Slapping a Goroth ambassador is apparently excellent publicity, Dr. Kim said dryly. From a xenopsychological perspective, what you did resonates with a lot of species who've been intimidated by the Dominion over the centuries. You acted out a fantasy that many of them have had, but never dared to pursue. You've become, somewhat absurdly, a symbol. A symbol of what? Of resistance to bullying, of standing up to power, of refusing to be intimidated, Secretary General Thompson said. These are values that resonate across species lines. It seems that humans aren't the only ones who admire someone willing to punch above their weight class. I didn't punch him, Marcus corrected. I slapped him. Even better, General Martinez laughed. A slap is more insulting than a punch. It says you didn't even take him seriously enough to hurt him. The more we analyze this, the more brilliant it looks. Completely accidental brilliance, but we'll take it. Marcus felt relief washing over him. So, I'm not being recalled to Earth in disgrace? Oh, you're definitely being recalled, Director Chen said, but not in disgrace. The hour-long recess stretched into 2 hours. Marcus spent the time fielding questions from curious representatives while trying to prepare for whatever the Elder Circle would decide. The more he talked with other species, the more he realized how complex the galactic political landscape really was. The Goroth Dominion wasn't just disliked. They were feared and resented in equal measure. Their long history of conquest had left deep scars across the galaxy. The fact that they'd been forced into the Council framework hadn't erased the memories of the species they'd subjugated or destroyed. Many civilizations maintained a careful diplomatic dance with the Goroth, showing enough respect to avoid becoming targets while never truly accepting their authority. Marcus had stumbled into something bigger than a simple diplomatic incident. He'd touched a nerve that ran through galactic politics like a fault line. When the Council was finally recalled to session, the chamber felt different. The atmosphere was charged with anticipation. Representatives who'd been casually chatting before now sat attentively in their seats. Even Curvan, who'd spent the recess in private consultation with his aides, seemed more alert than usual. Arbiter Zelnoth floated to the center of the chamber, accompanied by 3 additional arbiters that Marcus hadn't seen before. These were members of the Elder Circle, the highest authority in the Galactic Council. Their presence meant whatever decision had been reached was significant. The Elder Circle has carefully reviewed the incident between Ambassador Curvan of the Gorth Dominion and Representative Marcus Webb of Earth, Zelnoth began. We have examined the recordings, consulted our legal frameworks, and considered the broader implications for Council harmony. The chamber was absolutely silent. Our findings are as follows. First, Ambassador Curvan violated protocol by making veiled threats against a member species and by initiating unwanted physical contact with a fellow representative. These actions, while not severe enough to warrant expulsion, do require formal censure. Curvan's expression darkened, but he remained still. A censure was a black mark on a diplomat's record, one that would follow him for the rest of his career. For someone as proud as a Gorth, it was a significant punishment. Second, Representative Webb violated protocol by responding to unwanted physical contact with a physical strike. This action, while technically defensible under the Personal Space Protection Clause, was disproportionate and provocative. This also requires formal censure. Marcus had expected that. A censure for him was probably the lightest punishment Earth could have hoped for. However, and here Zelnoth's tentacles began glowing a color Marcus had never seen before, something between blue and gold, the Elder Circle recognizes that this incident has revealed a larger issue within our council. For too long, we have allowed certain species to operate in a gray area between legal compliance and actual intimidation. We have permitted veiled threats and displays of dominance to substitute for honest diplomatic engagement. We have, in essence, enabled a culture where might makes right, as long as the might is expressed indirectly enough to avoid formal sanction. Now Marcus understood the unusual tentacle color. It was determination mixed with resolve. Zelnoth wasn't just addressing the incident. They were addressing a systemic problem. The human representative's actions, while crude, have forced us to confront this reality. His species comes from a world where they have no single dominant power structure. They have centuries of experience with checks and balances, with systems designed to prevent any one group from becoming too powerful. Perhaps there is wisdom in this approach that we have overlooked. The representatives from dozens of species were leaning forward now, fascinated by where this was going. Therefore, the Elder Circle proposes a new framework for council interactions. We will be implementing stricter protocols regarding intimidation and threats, both overt and implied. Representatives who attempt to leverage their species' military or economic might in council discussions will face immediate sanctions. We will create an independent review board to examine complaints of bullying or coercion. And we will institute mandatory training for all ambassadors on appropriate diplomatic conduct. Curvan stood abruptly. This is an outrage. You're changing centuries of established practice because one primitive species can't handle adult conversation. No, Ambassador. One of the elder arbiters spoke for the first time, their voice ancient and weary. We are correcting centuries of established abuse because one species finally had the courage to call it out. Your behavior today was not an aberration. It was typical. It was what we've all learned to expect from the Gorth. And it was what we've all learned to tolerate because challenging it seemed too difficult, too dangerous. The human species represents an opportunity, Zelnoth continued. They're new enough to see our systems with fresh eyes, young enough to question practices we've accepted as inevitable. They remind us that intimidation is not diplomacy, and that allowing the strong to bully the weak ultimately weakens us all. Marcus sat very still, barely believing what he was hearing. His moment of anger had somehow catalyzed a reform movement in galactic politics. It was absurd. It was impossible. It was happening right in front of him. The vote will be held in 3 days, Zelnoth announced. All member species will have the opportunity to approve or reject these new protocols. In the meantime, this council stands adjourned. As representatives began filing out, talking excitedly among themselves. Marcus found himself surrounded again. But this time the mood was different. Species that had previously ignored him now wanted to shake his hand, or whatever their equivalent appendage was. The Tyrolean representative clapped him on the shoulder. "You magnificent fool," they said, their scales flashing bright yellow with joy. "You've started a revolution." "I just slapped someone," Marcus protested. "You slapped the right someone at the right time in the right place," a Keltharian corrected. "Sometimes that's all history needs." But not everyone was celebrating. Marcus noticed several species quietly conferring in corners, their body language suggesting worry or anger. The Gorath delegation had left immediately, their expressions dark. And there were others, species that had apparently benefited from the old system where might made right, who clearly weren't happy about potential changes. Commander Thex of the Drex approached Marcus with a serious expression. "Human, I must speak with you privately." They found another conference booth, and once sealed inside, Thex's demeanor changed completely. Gone was the friendly warrior. In its place was something grimmer. "You have made enemies today," Thex said bluntly. "Powerful enemies. The Gorath will not forget this insult, and they will not forgive. But, more importantly, there are species who profit from the current system. Species who use intimidation to gain favorable trade deals, territorial concessions, resource rights. You've threatened their entire way of operating." "I didn't mean to," Marcus said. "I just reacted to, your intentions don't matter. Only the results matter. And the result is that you've become a symbol of resistance to established power structures. Some will see you as a hero. Others will see you as a threat that must be eliminated." Marcus felt cold. "Are you saying someone might try to kill me?" "I'm saying someone might try to kill all of you," Thex said seriously. "If this reform passes, if the Council truly changes how it operates, there will be species who lose significant advantages. Some might decide the solution is to eliminate the catalyst. Earth is still vulnerable, human. You have minimal defenses, limited military capacity, and you're far from any major alliance networks. You would be an easy target. Then, why are you telling me this? The Drex benefit from the current system too, don't they?" "We do," Thex acknowledged. "But the Drex value honor above advantage. We believe in strength, yes, but also in fair combat. We respect an opponent who stands their ground, even when outmatched. What you did today was honorable in its own strange way. You stood up for your people knowing it might cost you everything. That deserves respect, not assassination. So what do? You prepare," Thex said. "You go home, and you make sure Earth can defend itself. Because the next few months will be critical. If the reforms pass, there will be species looking for ways to undermine them. Attacking Earth would send a clear message. But more than that, you need to build alliances. Find species who benefit from these changes and forge connections with them. The Drex, for example, would be interested in discussing mutual defense arrangements." Marcus's mind was racing. He'd started this day thinking he was just attending a routine council session about mineral rights. Now he was apparently at the center of a political revolution that might end with Earth being attacked. "Why would the Drex want to ally with humanity?" he asked. "We have nothing to offer you. No advanced technology, no military might, no resources you couldn't get elsewhere." Thex made a sound that might have been a laugh. "You have something rare in this galaxy, human. You have the will to fight when fighting makes no sense. You have the courage to stand up to powers that should terrify you. These qualities are valuable. The Drex have spent centuries conquering species that surrendered at the first sign of superior force. We respect strength, but we've come to realize that true strength isn't just about weapons or numbers. It's about spirit, and your species has spirit. That's a nice sentiment," Marcus said carefully. "But forgive me for being skeptical. What do the Drex really want?" "Smart," Thex nodded approvingly. "Never trust pretty words in politics. What we want is simple. We want to test ourselves against worthy opponents. Under the current council system, warfare is heavily restricted. We've been reduced to border skirmishes and proxy conflicts. But If these reforms pass, if the Council truly commits to protecting weaker species from intimidation, it opens up possibilities. The Drex could position ourselves as defenders, as a military force that ensures compliance with the new rules, that gives us purpose, combat opportunities, and political relevance. All we need are allies who won't stab us in the back. And you think humans won't? I think humans are too weak to betray anyone successfully right now, Thex said bluntly, which makes you the safest allies we could ask for. Plus, I like your style. Any species willing to slap a Goroth is a species worth knowing. Marcus couldn't help but smile. The logic was twisted, but it made sense in its own way. I'll need to discuss this with my superiors, but I think Earth would be very interested in a mutual defense arrangement with the Drex. Good. I'll have my people send formal proposals. In the meantime, watch your back. The next 3 days before the vote will be critical. There will be attempts to intimidate species into voting against the reforms. There may be attempts to remove you as a symbol. Stay alert. They left the booth and rejoined the thinning crowd in the council chamber. Marcus noticed Curvan and several other Goroth standing near one of the exits, clearly waiting for him. His stomach tightened, but Thex placed a heavy hand on his shoulder. "Walk with me," the Drex commander said. "Let's see if they're stupid enough to try something." They approached the exit together. As they got close, Curvan stepped into their path. His eyes were cold, and his voice was carefully controlled. "Representative Webb, a moment of your time." "Ambassador," Marcus replied neutrally. "I wanted to congratulate you," Curvan said, and the words were clearly bitter. "You've accomplished something remarkable today. You've made yourself and your entire species targets. The Goroth do not forget. We do not forgive. And we are very, very patient." "Is that another threat?" Marcus asked, because the Arbiters were pretty clear about consequences for that kind of thing now. "Not a threat, a promise. One day, when you least expect it, when you've grown comfortable and complacent, you'll remember this conversation. You'll remember that actions have consequences, and you'll wish you'd shown proper respect when you had the chance." "I'll take my chances," Marcus said. "Is there anything else?" Curvan stared at him for a long moment, then stepped aside. "Enjoy your moment of fame, human. It won't last." As Marcus and Thex walked away, the Drex made an approving sound. "You have courage, I'll give you that. Most species would be on their knees begging for forgiveness by now. Would that actually help? Not with the Goroth. They respect strength or nothing. But most species don't understand that. They think they can negotiate with predators. They can't. They can only show they're not prey." Marcus's communicator buzzed again. Another message from Earth, this time with attachment files. He opened them as they walked, and his eyes widened. "What is it?" Thex asked. "Apparently the news of what happened has spread to Earth. I'm all over the media feeds. They're calling me the human who slapped Bigfoot, and it's become a cultural phenomenon. There are memes, songs, full analysis pieces from political scientists. Someone even started a petition to make today a global holiday." Thex made that laughing sound again. "Your species is insane." The 3 days before the vote passed in a blur of activity that left Marcus exhausted. What had started as a simple diplomatic incident had mushroomed into something that consumed every waking hour. On Earth, the response was overwhelming. Marcus had become an overnight celebrity. His face was on every news feed, his actions debated in every forum. The fact that humanity's representative had stood up to a 3-meter-tall alien warrior resonated deeply with people who'd spent their entire lives as the new kids on the galactic block, wondering if humanity would ever be taken seriously among the stars. The media had latched onto the Bigfoot comparison immediately. Curvan did bear a striking resemblance to the legendary cryptid from Earth folklore, and the image of Marcus slapping him had been turned into countless jokes, artwork, and even a surprisingly catchy song that had hit #1 on global charts within 48 hours. But beneath the humor and celebration, there was serious work being done. Director Chun had assembled a team of negotiators, lawyers, and military advisors to help Marcus navigate the political storm he'd created. They worked around the clock, reaching out to species that might support the reforms building coalitions and preparing responses to the inevitable backlash. The Gorith weren't the only ones opposed to the changes. At least 15 other species had expressed concerns about the proposed reforms, each for their own reasons. Some worried about reduced flexibility in negotiations. Others feared that stricter protocols would make the council too bureaucratic. A few were more honest about their objections, essentially admitting that they'd benefited from being able to intimidate weaker species and didn't want to lose that advantage. Marcus spent hours in virtual meetings with representatives from dozens of civilizations. The Tyroleans were enthusiastic supporters, seeing the reforms as a way to level the playing field for smaller species. The Keltharians were cautiously optimistic, wanting to ensure that legitimate security concerns wouldn't be hampered by excessive regulation. The Brennix Collective was supportive, but worried about enforcement mechanisms. And then there were the surprises. The Vexari, a species Marcus knew almost nothing about, reached out with strong support for the reforms. Their representative, a being of pure energy contained in a crystalline matrix, explained that they'd been victims of Gorith aggression thousands of years ago and barely survived. They saw the reforms as long overdue justice. The momentum seemed to be building toward passage, but there were complications. Several species that had initially expressed support suddenly went quiet. When Marcus's team investigated, they found evidence of pressure being applied behind the scenes. Trade deals being threatened, security arrangements being questioned, the old system fighting back against change. On the second day, something more serious happened. A transport ship carrying a delegation from the Prysian Concordance, a species that had publicly supported the reforms, suffered a catastrophic malfunction that killed everyone aboard. The official investigation called it a tragic accident, but the timing was suspicious. The Pryxians immediately withdrew their support, citing concerns about safety. "This is intimidation," Marcus said during a meeting with his Earth team. "Someone's making examples." "We can't prove anything," Ambassador Liu replied. The Prysian ship's failure could legitimately have been an accident. These things happen in space travel, but they don't happen coincidentally right before a major vote that would hurt certain powerful species, General Martinez said grimly. "Webb's right. Someone's sending a message." "Which means Earth might be next," Director Chen said quietly. That thought had been keeping Marcus awake at night. Earth had minimal defenses compared to most galactic civilizations. If someone wanted to make an example of humanity, they probably could. The only thing protecting Earth right now was the political fallout such an action would cause, and that protection felt increasingly fragile. The Drex had followed through on their offer, submitting formal proposals for a mutual defense arrangement. The terms were surprisingly reasonable. They weren't asking for bases on Earth or control over human military forces. Instead, they proposed a simple agreement. If Earth was attacked, the Drex would respond. In return, Earth would support Drex positions on the Council regarding military matters and accept Drex military advisors to help build up human defenses. "It's a good deal," General Martinez had said. "Almost too good. I keep waiting for the catch." "The catch is that it paints a target on both of our backs," Dr. Kim explained. "The Drex are positioning themselves as enforcers of a new order if the reforms pass. By allying with us, they're making a statement about whose side they're on. That makes both species targets for anyone who wants the old system to continue." "But if the reforms fail," Ambassador Liu countered, "having Drex protection might be the only thing keeping Earth safe from retaliation." They'd accepted the proposal, though the formal signing was delayed until after the vote. No point in antagonizing potential allies prematurely. On the third day, Marcus was summoned to a private meeting with Arbiter Zelnoth. He went alone, as requested, though his security detail wasn't happy about it. The Arbiter's private chambers were nothing like the Grand Council Hall. This space was intimate, almost cozy by the standards of beings who floated rather than walked. Soft bioluminescent plants provided gentle light, and the walls displayed slowly shifting patterns that Marcus found oddly calming. "Thank you for coming, Representative Webb," Zelnoth said, their tentacles a soft blue that indicated peaceful intentions. I wanted to speak with you privately before tomorrow's vote. Of course, Arbiter, though I'm not sure what I can add at this point. The proposals speak for themselves. Indeed they do. But I wanted to understand something about humanity that our files don't make clear. When you struck Ambassador Curvan, were you acting on instinct, or was there calculation behind it? Marcus considered the question carefully. Honestly, both. My instinct was to respond to physical intimidation with physical pushback. That's been trained into me through years of military service and, frankly, through growing up in Earth's culture. But there was also a calculation, though it happened very quickly. I knew that backing down would set a bad precedent for humanity. I knew that showing weakness might make us targets. So when my instinct told me to push back, my calculation told me not to override that instinct. Fascinating, Zelnoth mused. Most species separate instinct from reason. They view them as competing forces. But you seem to integrate them. Humans are good at rationalizing our impulses, Marcus said with a slight smile. We can convince ourselves that what we wanted to do anyway is actually the smart choice. Or perhaps you're good at recognizing when your instincts are actually wiser than your overthinking, Zelnoth suggested. The Elder Circle has been debating this question for 3 days. Are humans dangerous because they're unpredictable? Or are they valuable because they're willing to act when others would hesitate? What did you decide? We decided that the answer is yes to both questions and that this is not necessarily a contradiction. The Arbiter floated closer. Representative Webb, I'm going to share something with you that few outside the Elder Circle know. The Galactic Council has existed for over 30,000 years. In that time, we've seen hundreds of species join and dozens leave or go extinct. We've witnessed cycles of peace and conflict, periods of great cooperation, and terrible division. That's a long history. It is. And throughout all of it, there's been a pattern. Species fall into one of 3 categories. First, there are the conquerors. Species like the Gorath, who see the galaxy as something to dominate. They respect strength and nothing else. Second, there are the survivors. Species who've learned to adapt, to bend without breaking, to find their niche and protect it carefully. This is the majority. And third, there are the challengers. Species who question, who push back, who refuse to accept the status quo, even when accepting it would be safer. Marcus had a feeling he knew where this was going. Let me guess. Humans are challengers. Humans are the most pure example of challengers we've seen in 1,000 years, Zelnoth confirmed. Most species that develop this trait either evolve past it before reaching the stars, or they destroy themselves through conflict. But you've managed to carry this quality into the galactic age. It makes you fascinating and dangerous in equal measure. Dangerous to whom? To the established order. To species comfortable with their positions in the hierarchy. To anyone who benefits from others not asking difficult questions. Zelnoth's tentacles swirled in complex patterns, but also potentially valuable to the galaxy as a whole. Stagnation is a real risk for civilizations as old as ours. We've developed such elaborate rules and traditions that sometimes we forget why we created them in the first place. Having a species that asks why not instead of why could be exactly what we need. Or it could tear the council apart. Marcus said, that is the fear, yes. Tomorrow's vote isn't really about protocols and procedures. It's about whether the Galactic Council is willing to change. Whether we can adapt to accommodate a species that doesn't fit our existing patterns. Whether we're mature enough as a civilization to admit that some of our traditions have become tools of oppression rather than frameworks for cooperation. No pressure, Marcus said dryly. Zelnoth made a sound that might have been laughter. Indeed. But I wanted you to understand what's truly at stake. If the reforms pass, you will have succeeded in changing the galaxy. Not through military might or technological superiority, but through the simple act of saying no when everyone expected you to say yes. That is power of a different kind. And if they fail, then we'll have learned that the galaxy isn't ready for change, that the old patterns are too deeply entrenched, and humanity will need to decide whether to adapt to a system that doesn't truly respect you, or to chart your own course and accept the consequences. Marcus thought about that. It was the same choice he'd faced when Curvan put his hand on his shoulder. Bend or stand firm. Accept the system or challenge it. Neither option was safe. Can I ask you something, Arbiter? Of course. What do you want to happen? Personally, not as an Arbiter. Zelnoth was quiet for a long moment. When they spoke, their tentacles had shifted to a color Marcus couldn't quite identify, something between hope and resignation. I want to believe that we can change. That 30,000 years of history don't have to define the next 30,000. That the arrival of humanity represents an opportunity rather than a threat. But I've also seen how difficult change is, how much resistance it generates, how many times good intentions have failed because the weight of tradition was too heavy to overcome. So you're not sure. The Grand Council chamber had never been so crowded. Every species that held membership had sent representatives, not just ambassadors, but observers, analysts, and in some cases, their highest government officials. The gallery seats that usually sat empty were packed with beings watching history unfold. Marcus took his seat in the human delegation area, trying to ignore the cameras and sensors pointed at him. This vote was being broadcast across the galaxy, watched by trillions of beings on thousands of worlds. No pressure whatsoever. Director Chun sat beside him, having arrived from Earth specifically for this moment. "How are you holding up?" she asked quietly. "I've been better," Marcus admitted. "I've also been worse. Still not sure which category today falls into." "You started something remarkable, Marcus. Regardless of how this vote goes, you should be proud of that." "I slapped someone. That's not exactly a great diplomatic achievement. You stood up for your principles when it would have been easier not to. That's always an achievement." Arbiter Zelnoth entered with the full Elder Circle, their presence indicating the gravity of the moment. The chamber fell silent as they took their positions at the center. "Representatives of the Galactic Council," Zelnoth began, their voice carrying clearly through the translation matrices. "Today we vote on proposed reforms to Council protocols regarding intimidation, coercion, and abuse of power. These reforms were necessitated by an incident 3 days ago, but they address issues that have existed for centuries. Before we begin the voting process, we will hear final statement from both supporters and opponents of the measure." A Tyrolean representative spoke first in favor, eloquently describing how smaller species had lived in fear of their larger neighbors for generations. A Keltharian followed, detailing specific instances where intimidation had been used to force unfair agreements. Then, a Brennick spoke about how the threat of violence had shaped their diplomatic choices for decades. On the opposition side, a representative from the Harkron Collective argued that the reforms would make the Council too rigid, unable to respond quickly to genuine threats. A Valmiri diplomat suggested that the measures went too far, that they would criminalize normal assertiveness in negotiations. And then Curvan stood to speak. The chamber tensed. The Gorth ambassador had been uncharacteristically quiet since the initial incident, which made everyone nervous. Curvan was never quiet unless he was planning something. "Honored arbiters, fellow representatives," he began, his tone measured and diplomatic. "I stand before you today not as an opponent of reform, but as a voice of caution. The Gorth Dominion has been accused of intimidation, of using our strength to coerce others. These accusations are not entirely without merit." Murmurs rippled through the chamber. No one had expected Curvan to admit anything. "My people are warriors. We evolved on a harsh world where strength meant survival. We brought that culture with us to the stars. And yes, sometimes we have allowed our natural instincts to override diplomatic niceties. For this, I apologize." Marcus blinked. Had a Gorth just apologized? Director Chun looked equally shocked. "However," Curvan continued, "I must question whether the solution to occasional excess is to create a system so restrictive that honest communication becomes impossible. These reforms, as written, could be interpreted to prevent any show of confidence or assertion of interests. They could turn diplomacy into a game where everyone is so afraid of giving offense that nothing meaningful gets accomplished. The Gorath Dominion proposes a counter-proposal. We will agree to stricter oversight of our own conduct. We will accept monitoring of our diplomatic interactions. We will even agree to mandatory conflict resolution training. But we ask that these measures be implemented gradually, with opportunities for adjustment based on practical experience rather than immediate, sweeping changes that could have unintended consequences. It was a masterful speech. Curvan had acknowledged problems while positioning himself as reasonable, someone willing to compromise rather than someone fighting to preserve an unjust system. Marcus had to admire the political skill, even as he recognized it for what it was, an attempt to water down the reforms until they were meaningless. Several species shifted in their seats. The counter-proposal sounded reasonable on the surface. Gradual change, careful implementation, opportunities for adjustment. It was the kind of language that appealed to cautious administrators. Then, Zelnoth did something unexpected. Representative Webb, would you care to respond to Ambassador Curvan's counter-proposal? Every eye in the chamber turned to Marcus. He stood slowly mind-racing. This was it. This was his chance to either seal support for real change or watch it slip away into endless committees and gradual implementation that would never actually happen. Thank you, Arbiter, he said, his voice steady despite his nerves. Ambassador Curvan's speech was impressive. He acknowledged problems, offered solutions, and positioned himself as a voice of reason. If I didn't know better, I'd be convinced. Marcus paused, looking directly at Curvan. But I do know better. 3 days ago, this same ambassador made barely veiled threats about obliterating Earth. He used his physical presence to intimidate me. He leveraged his species' military might to make it clear that humanity should know our place. That wasn't diplomatic excess. That wasn't cultural misunderstanding. That was deliberate intimidation designed to make me back down. The chamber was absolutely silent. Ambassador Curvan now asks us to trust that gradual reform will solve these problems. That monitoring will be enough. That training will change behavior. But here's what I've learned about bullies in my life. They don't change because they want to. They change because they have to. They change when the costs of their behavior finally outweigh the benefits. Marcus gestured around the chamber. How many species here have similar stories? How many of you have been intimidated, threatened, or coerced by species with more power? How many times have you agreed to unfavorable terms because the alternative was too risky? How many times have you watched injustice happen and said nothing because speaking up would make you a target? He saw heads nodding, subtle gestures of agreement from dozens of species. The counterproposal sounds reasonable because it's designed to sound reasonable. But it's also designed to ensure nothing actually changes. Gradual implementation means years of committees and subcommittees. Opportunities for adjustment means endless renegotiation. What Ambassador Curvan is really asking for is permission to continue business as usual while appearing to reform. Marcus took a breath. I'm not a diplomat. I'm not a politician. I'm just someone who got angry at being pushed around and pushed back. But I understand one thing very clearly. Change is hard. Real change is threatening. Real change makes powerful people uncomfortable because it threatens their power. That's exactly why it's necessary. Humanity is new here. We don't have thousands of years of galactic history. We don't have massive fleets or advanced weapons or economic dominance. All we have is the belief that everyone deserves to be treated with respect, regardless of their size or strength. That belief is worth fighting for. It's worth taking risks for. And it's worth voting for, even when the easier path is to accept gradual, meaningless reform. Marcus sat down, his heart pounding. Director Chun squeezed his shoulder once, a gesture of support. Curvan stood again. Eloquent words from a young species. But eloquence is not wisdom. The human speaks of change as if it's always positive. But rapid change can be destructive. It can tear apart systems that have maintained stability for millennia. Is that really what we want? To risk chaos for the sake of idealism? Yes, a voice called out. It was the Tyrolean representative. Because the stability you describe is built on the suffering of weaker species. It's peace purchased through intimidation. That's not stability. That's oppression with a diplomatic face. Here, here, another voice agreed. A Keltharian this time. Suddenly, dozens of representatives were speaking at once, some agreeing with the Tyrolean, others supporting Kurvan's caution. The chamber descended into controlled chaos until Zelnoth's voice cut through. Order. We will maintain order in this chamber. The Arbiter's tentacles were flashing red with authority. The time for debate has ended. We will now proceed to the vote. The voting process was surprisingly simple. Each species had a single vote, regardless of size or power. The measure required a 2/3 majority to pass. A holographic display appeared in the center of the chamber, showing the tally as votes were cast. Marcus watched the numbers climb. The Tyroleans voted yes immediately. So did the Brennix Collective. The Keltharians took a moment longer, but also voted yes. Species after species registered their votes, the totals climbing on both sides. The Gorith voted no, as expected. So did several species that had historically allied with them. The Harkron Collective voted no. The Valmiri voted no. But for every no vote, 2 or 3 species voted yes. The momentum was building. Species that had been cautious, that had hedged their bets for days, were now committing to change. The message Marcus had sent, that standing up to bullies was possible, was resonating. The Drex voted yes, which surprised some people, but not Marcus. Commander Thex had been clear about their interests. They wanted a new order where they could position themselves as enforcers. This vote aligned with those goals. The total kept climbing. 60% in favor. 65%. The 2/3 threshold was 66.7%. It was going to be close. 70% in favor. Marcus allowed himself to breathe. They'd done it. The reforms would pass. But then something strange happened. 3 species that had already voted yes changed their votes to no. The holographic display showed their revisions, the overall percentage dropping back to 68%. What just happened? Director Chen whispered. Pressure, Marcus replied quietly. Someone's calling in favors or making threats right now. 2 more species changed their votes, down to 67%. They were still above the threshold, but barely. Zelnoth noticed the shifting votes as well. I remind all representatives that votes are final once cast. Changes are only permitted if there was an error in the initial recording. Are these vote changes due to recording errors? Silence. The species that had changed their votes wouldn't meet the Arbiter's gaze. I see, Zelnoth said coldly. Then, these vote changes are not recognized. Your original votes stand. The total jumped back up to 70%. Kurfan stood. Arbiter, with respect, representatives have the right to change their votes if they feel their interests weren't properly considered in their initial decision. They have that right during the voting period, Zelnoth agreed. But that period has now ended. The final tally shows 70% in favor. The reforms pass. The chamber erupted. Cheers from some species, angry protests from others. The holographic display showed the final numbers, making it official. Marcus felt something loosen in his chest. They'd actually done it. Real change was coming to the Galactic Council. But his relief was short-lived. Kurvan turned to look directly at him, and the expression on the Gorith's face was pure malice. The message was clear. This isn't over. In the chaos following the vote, species began forming groups. Those who'd supported the reforms were clustering together, already discussing implementation. Those who'd opposed were doing the same, clearly planning their next moves. Commander Thex pushed through the crowd to reach Marcus. Congratulations, human. You've made history today. Thanks. Though I'm not sure making history was a good idea. Probably not. Thex agreed cheerfully. But it's too late now. You're committed. Which means Earth needs protection more than ever. I suggest we sign that mutual defense agreement immediately. Agreed, Director Chan said, joining them. Our legal team can have the documents ready within the hour. They moved to a side chamber to finalize the agreement, but Marcus kept one eye on the main floor. Curvan was in deep conversation with ambassadors from at least 8 different species. Whatever they were planning, it wasn't going to be good. As the formal treaty signing concluded, Marcus felt both triumph and dread. They'd won this battle, but the war was just beginning. The old order wouldn't give up without a fight, and Earth was still vulnerable. What happens now? He asked Thex. The Drex warrior considered the question. Now we prepare. The species that oppose these reforms will look for ways to undermine them. They'll test the boundaries, look for loopholes, try to prove the system doesn't work. Some might even take more direct action, like attacking Earth. Possibly, though with our alliance now public, that becomes more complicated for them. Attacking Earth means engaging the Drex military, which most species would prefer to avoid. But there are other ways to hurt you. Economic sanctions, trade restrictions, diplomatic isolation. Sounds fun. Welcome to galactic politics, Thex said with what might have been a smile. You wanted to be treated as equals. This is what equality looks like. Everyone trying to advance their interests while undermining yours. Over the next few hours, as species filed out of the council chamber, Marcus received communications from dozens of civilizations. Some offering congratulations, others proposing new diplomatic relationships, a few making barely disguised threats. The message from Earth Command was brief, but significant. Public response overwhelmingly positive. You're a hero. Also, we're fast-tracking defense spending. Apparently, standing up to aliens makes military budgets a lot easier to pass. Well done. That made Marcus smile, despite his exhaustion. At least something good was coming from all this. As he prepared to leave the council station, heading back to Earth for the first time in weeks, Marcus found himself face-to-face with Arbiter Zelnoth one final time. Representative Webb, the Arbiter, said, their tentacles a warm gold color. You've changed the galaxy today. I hope you understand the significance of what you've accomplished. I'm starting to, Marcus replied, though I'm not sure if I should be proud or terrified. Both would be appropriate. The path ahead will not be easy. There will be resistance, setbacks, possibly even violence. But you've proven something important. That change is possible, even in systems that seem immovable. That matters more than you know. Thank you, Arbiter, for giving me the chance to speak, for supporting the reforms, for everything. Thank you for having the courage to act when action was needed, Zelnoth replied. The galaxy needs more species like humanity. Species willing to question, to challenge, to stand up for what's right, even when it's uncomfortable. Don't lose that quality as you grow and mature as a civilization. We'll try not to, Marcus promised. As his ship departed the council station, heading back toward Earth, Marcus looked out at the stars and thought about everything that had happened. He'd gone to a routine diplomatic session and ended up starting a revolution. He'd slapped a Gorath ambassador and somehow made humanity relevant on a galactic stage. He'd turned a moment of anger into a catalyst for real change. It was absurd. It was improbable. It was very, very human. And as the stars streaked past, Marcus allowed himself to feel something he hadn't felt in days. Hope. Hope that humanity had found its place in the galaxy. Hope that standing up to bullies still mattered, even among the stars. Hope that courage and determination could still change the world, or in this case, change thousands of worlds. The journey back to Earth would take 3 days. Marcus spent most of it sleeping, recovering from the exhaustion of the past week. When he finally woke for the final approach, his communicator was flooded with messages. The Tyroleans wanted to establish an embassy on Earth. The Keltharians were proposing joint research initiatives. The Vexari were offering cultural exchange programs. Even species that had voted against the reforms were reaching out, either to repair relationships or to ensure they weren't left behind as new alliances formed. Earth had arrived on the galactic stage, and they'd arrived with impact. As his ship entered Earth's atmosphere, Marcus could see celebrations happening in cities around the globe. Massive screens were showing footage from the council vote. People were cheering, waving flags, celebrating humanity's moment of defiance. He'd become a symbol, which was both flattering and terrifying. Symbols had to live up to expectations, had to maintain the image that people projected onto them. Marcus wasn't sure he could do that. He was just a man who'd gotten angry and acted on it. But maybe that was enough. Maybe humanity didn't need perfect heroes. Maybe they just needed people willing to try, willing to stand up, willing to say no when everyone expected yes. The ship landed at UN headquarters in Geneva, where a crowd had gathered despite the late hour. Marcus stepped out to a roar of approval, to cameras flashing, to reporters shouting questions. Secretary General Thompson was there to greet him personally. "Welcome home, Marcus. You made us all very proud." "I just hope I didn't start a war," Marcus replied. "Even if you did," Thompson said with a smile, "it would be a war worth fighting. Sometimes standing up for your principles has costs, but the cost of not standing up is always higher in the long run." Marcus thought about that as he was escorted through the crowds, as he waved to people celebrating in the streets, as he saw children holding signs that read, "Humanity doesn't back down," and "We stand together." He'd slapped Bigfoot in front of the council, and somehow that simple act of defiance had given millions of people hope. Hope that humanity mattered. Hope that they could hold their own among civilizations thousands of years older. Hope that courage still counted for something in a galaxy that ran on power and politics. It was a heavy responsibility. But as Marcus looked at the faces around him, at the pride and determination in their eyes, he felt ready to carry it. The galaxy had been put on notice. Humanity was here, and they wouldn't be pushed around. Not by the Gorath. Not by anyone. And it had all started with one slap. One moment of refusing to back down. One human showing the galaxy exactly what humanity was made of. The story was just beginning, but Marcus Webb knew one thing for certain. Whatever came next, humanity would face it standing tall, refusing to bend, ready to defend their dignity and their place among the stars. Because that's what humans did. They stood up to bullies, no matter how big those bullies were. Even if those bullies looked like Bigfoot. "I'm not sure," Zelnoth admitted. "Which is why tomorrow's vote is so important. It will show us who we really are as a galactic community. Whether we're capable of growth or simply maintaining what we've already built." Marcus left the meeting with a lot to think about. He'd started this thinking about himself, about humanity, about immediate consequences. But Zelnoth had shown him the bigger picture. Tomorrow's vote would echo through galactic history for centuries, regardless of the outcome. And he'd inadvertently become the face of that moment. Back at the human delegation quarters, his team was making final preparations. They'd done everything they could to secure votes, to build coalitions, to counter the opposition. Now, it was just a matter of waiting to see if it was enough. "Yeah," Marcus agreed. "We really are." Marcus's hand moved faster than Curvan expected. It wasn't a punch. It wasn't an attack meant to cause real damage. It was something much simpler and much more insulting.